Welcome to our third webinar in our 9-part series of the End of Life Symposium. Today's focus is on patient perspectives on medical aid in dying. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you a very inspiring and talented physician. She serves as the chair and course director for the End of Life Symposium, Dr. Chandana Banerjee.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to City of Hope's End of Life Symposium webinar series. As many of you that are returning to the series might know, this webinar series is divided into 3 critical areas that address end-of-life issues: humanities at the end of life, clinical aspects at the end of life, and medical aid in dying. Today's webinar falls in the medical aid in dying area with a focus on patient perspectives. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Donna Smith, who is the Director of National African American Outreach for Compassion and Choices.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. It's an honor to be with all of you here today. In addition to being the Director of National African American Outreach, I also am the Campaign Director in Maryland and DC for the Medical Aid in Dying legislation. Our objective today is to explore the process and experience of medical aid in dying from the perspective of the dying patient and their families. Medical aid in dying is the process where a mentally competent adult who is terminally ill and their prognosis is that they have 6 months or less to live can ask their medical provider for a prescription for a medication that they may choose to self-ingest and to bring about a gentle and peaceful death. Right now, medical aid in dying is authorized in 9 states and Washington, D.C., with many other states considering the legislation this year. With that, I would like to introduce our esteemed guest today. Our first guest is Mr. Tom Welley. Mr. Welley is a software engineer from San Luis Obispo, California. He graduated from Cal Poly in 2002 and is the father of 2 young daughters. Tom was the primary caregiver for his late wife, Christine, who endured a 6-year battle with melanoma. Tom?
Thank you, Donna. I want to start by giving a quick introduction of who Christine was. You'll see in the next slide, there we are smiling in front of our house. Christine was a kind of wild, crazy redhead, if you know a few wild, crazy redheads. She had a vivacious spirit, very active. She was a runner when we met. She inspired me to run some of my first half marathons. And she was outgoing, the life of the party, and believed in having a good time. And of course, I fell in love, right? This is my wife here. And things were going along very good in our relationship. And at one point, Christine visited a doctor because she had a lump on her neck, and only discovered she was already at stage 2B of melanoma. And this was in September 2012. So she decided to be very active and fight this thing since it was fairly, we thought, isolated to her neck. We found an oncologist that she liked. He was a no-nonsense, straight-to-the-science kind of guy. His bedside manner wasn't what I would consider happy or bubbly. He was like straight-up science kind of guy. But that's what Christine wanted, right? So we started having surgeries to remove, looking at margins over the next few months, but they couldn't seem to get it under control. It spread down into her lymph system of her right shoulder. Slowly started working its way down to her rib cage over the next 6 months or so. And we had to start making harder choices, like what therapeutics are we going to attack, what radiation treatments, what things could we do to fight this. And so we ended up going through a series over the next couple of years of clinical trials, actually, to try things out. And most of it seemed to be working. Like Christine was fighting hard. We were making trips back and forth to different places. We were working with an oncologist. Things were going okay at this point, but over time, it just slowly got worse, right? We're a few years in, and it's gone down into her abdomen area, but they fought it there and chased it back out. And then eventually pieces started popping up into her brain. The things we were doing weren't really working in that area. And so we had to pursue other ways. We had to start doing gamma radiation treatments. Those were a few hour drive away. Christine's very sick during this time. She's struggling things. She's trying to make her house work. I'm still trying to work and balance things with her and the kids, trying to mix all these things together. And it can be exhausting at times, but Christine was her own best advocate. She fought for herself and she fought hard. Like, she wanted a good life. We did things during this time too, when she had breaks between treatments. Like, she chose to go to Thailand right in the middle of treatments. And another time right here, like you can see, we went to the Grand Canyon during a solstice. Not near solstice, I mean, during where the sun blocks it out. What's that called? I always been drawing a complete blank. But we were there for one of those days, and it was just phenomenal, amazing. And we fit these things in that fit her lifestyle because she thrived and wanted to live, right? But then things kept getting worse, and she had this fight about her. We went off to weddings still. You wouldn't know it necessarily from the outside that she was fighting and struggling so hard. But she kept going and kept going and kept going and kept doing treatments, struggling every way she could to fight this. As you can see here with my two daughters, they grew between these pictures. This shows you how long she struggled and fought against this. Both these pictures were during treatment. One with the kids pretty young and one with the kids a little bit older, and there's a lot there. But it kept growing, right? As you can see here, she has a bandage on the side of her head. Eventually, the melanoma moved up into her brain. And so we started doing the gamma radiations. At one point, decided to actually do surgery a couple times. So she ended up having to go in for treatment. We spent 14 days at UCLA one time with me struggling to sleep on the couch and balancing that out. And it was over Christmas and New Year's, which is a really weird time to be stuck in a hospital room. Missing the family functions that we were normally used to, away from home. We live three and a half hours, almost 4 hours from UCLA when there's no traffic. So that's quite a journey back and forth to make things work and happen for her during this time. She had her skull replaced with a mesh. They tried to do a graft from her thigh to her head. It didn't take. And at one point, she ended up with a wound back on her head for over 6 months. Nearing the end of her life. So at this point, things are moving on, right? We're into 2017, we're into 2018. Her and I have visited multiple times about what did she want her end of life to look at? Because we knew it was coming, we just didn't know when. And we had realized that medical aid in dying was an option for us at this point because the law had been passed here in California. So she expressed her desire to me that she would go that route. And as it became closer, I said, okay, now we need to start looking. So Christine reached out to her oncologist that she really liked. And he said no. He wasn't supportive of it. And it kind of just blew our mind, like, wait a minute, we just assumed that it was our choice. We didn't realize the doctors also had a choice. We hadn't been really paying that much attention at this point. I also realized, we got to do something different. So Christine, her own best advocate again, started calling around to local hospices. All the local hospices in our area, there's 4 of them in San Luis Obispo, said no, they weren't practicing that, or nor would they help at that point. And that kind of threw us for a loop. Like, when your local medical provider and your local hospices won't help or are unwilling to help, what do you do at this point? Christine started calling further and further away, trying to get information like, what is this medical aid in dying? How do I get access to it? The information just wasn't there in the spring of 2018. So she didn't know what to do. At one point, she did get pointed to Compassion and Choices. She made some phone calls, she made some emails, and she got some pointers on how to make this happen. We then realized we had a relationship with UCLA that we could take advantage of. The only problem was UCLA is 4 hours away and she's extremely sick at this point. But we realized we could do that. So we made multiple round trips to UCLA, because you have to make, at the point in time, you had to make multiple round trips in person. So we figured out a way to get her down there and back and forth to multiple doctor visits to go through the process of giving her first written request, giving her first oral request, waiting the days, coming back to do it again. But we ran into another hiccup during all this. We finally got that first written request in, and on the way home, I saw a Facebook notification that someone had petitioned the court and won an injunction to stop everything for a while. So we weren't even the process came to a halt. UCLA reached out to us and said, we can't process your request at this point. And we're like in a state of limbo. Like, what do we do now? We had submitted a request, but now we can't process it. Like, we can't do anything about it. Placed into a really weird headspace. Christine wanted to go the way she wanted to go. She had lived her life the way she wanted to do, and she wanted to die the way she wanted to die. She had seen her grandmother die a very slow, painful death. And she herself did not want to repeat that. Her grandmother had died from breast cancer. And Christine wanted to go in her own way. And this medical aid in dying would give her that option, yet here it was being withheld from us due to a court system. Eventually, the state Secretary of State for California intervened, the state Supreme Court intervened and decided in favor of the existing law as it's written. And we were able to move forward after UCLA respun up the program. But by this time, almost a full month had passed between requests. So we are trying to figure all this out, trying to understand how to get the things. So we finally get some medication. At this point, Christine's pretty weak, but we did go down and pick up her prescription, paid for it, and came home. And she had to decide when she wanted to take it at that point, or if she wanted to. It gave her a huge peace of mind to know that she had that available to her at this point. And you could see the weight relax off of her. And then on August 25th, 2018, Christine decided that was the day. She worked with a death doula and set up the time and how she wanted to do it. We walked through a couple of practice sessions of just seeing what it would feel like to us. And then the day came. She surprised me, of course. She had a playlist on Pandora I knew nothing about. That was really beautiful, but yet fun and wacky. She had her own songs. They're unique and different and funny. And I was able to hold her, and the dog sat in her lap as she ingested, and she passed on. And she went the way she wanted, at home with the people around her that she wanted around her at her death, rather than being stuck in a hospital. She went the way she wanted to go, and it was a beautiful time for her. We had to say her goodbye. She got to hold me. She got to cry the way she wanted to cry. She got to wear the outfit she wanted to wear. And I think the next picture, maybe the picture before, had a picture of her in a gown, the way she wanted. So she went the way she wanted. Yeah, see the gown right there on the right. That's one of her last things she wanted to wear in her life, was that at our house. And it didn't end there. She left pictures for me that I knew nothing about. She was a bit of an artist. And so I found this that she provided for me, with her and I commemorating our journey and her going the way she wanted. So it was a difficult process. It was a different process than we thought. And I think it's important for patients to know that it's not always straightforward. You have to ask a lot of questions. You have to know what you're wanting, and you have to know what your rights are as a patient to ask for what you need. So with that, I'd like to ask Donna back on.
Tom, thank you for sharing you and your wife's story. I think it's so important for others to hear. Our next participant is Stella Dawson. She's a communication strategist at the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, which is a think tank on financial inclusion. For 27 years, she was a journalist for Reuters, reporting from all over the world on economics and financial markets. She has lived in Washington, D.C. for the past 10 years, the city where she first met her spouse, Mary Klein, in 1980. Stella?
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Tom. You've got me in tears already. And I warn you, I'm very good at crying. Mary Klein died of ovarian cancer on August the 7th, 2018. She took 100 milligrams of secobarbital sodium, which hastened her death. From the very first day that Mary was diagnosed with cancer, she knew that she wanted medication to end her life. She sat me down and she took my hands and she said, "Stella, we are going to do this well. We're going to do our very best, but I want to be able to die at home on my terms when I'm ready." We'd never discussed dying before, but it came as no surprise to me This was a vibrantly alive woman, courageous, ferociously independent. She was a journalist, an experimental visual and performing artist. She'd shown her work all around the world and around the country. Later in life, she trained her dogs, always German shepherds, in agility and obedience and protection. She competed with them. Mary lived on her own terms, with integrity, and she wanted to die exactly the same way, with agency and with dignity. And that I knew deep in my heart, even if I'd wanted to persuade her otherwise, there's no way I could prevent her. We were a generation of women who had fought for self-control over our own bodies, and those principles were not going to be denied to Mary at the end of her life. But first, she did everything she could in her power to live. She was cut with radical surgery from her pubic bone to her sternum. She was stitched back up together again with 47 industrial-sized staples. She started dense dose chemotherapy weeks after the surgery and put her into the emergency room nearly every weekend. This is a picture of one of those visits. She had 2 hospitalizations that were so serious her doctor would sit quietly beside her bedside every morning, just helping her to muster the strength to carry on. She wanted to live to see our grandnephew grow up. He was conceived just as she went into surgery. She went through 50 rounds of different types of chemotherapy and its side effects: blocked bowels, nerve damage, made it difficult to walk, heart problems, blood clots. And I think you all know in the medical profession how brutal chemotherapy can be. But whilst Mary was doing everything she possibly could in order to live, she also was investigating her death. She joined Exit International. She registered with Dignitas, the Swiss clinic. She researched where she could access medications to die. She was looking at China, India, Peru, and I found myself in one bizarre moment Googling a veterinarian in Mexico City where I was going to work to see if I could pick up the medication. But Mary said, "Don't you dare, I'm not going to have you arrested at the border for smuggling something in." So instead, she was quietly stockpiling pills in a cupboard in her study. She never discussed it with me. I just came across them one day. I tell you all of this so that you can understand that while she did everything in her power to stay alive, she also was doing everything she possibly could to see how she could determine her own death. But medically, we were absolutely alone. We were entering the shady world of undercover drug dealings, no knowledge of drug purity, shaky understanding of quantities to ingest. And the biggest fear that I had was that we would have to fly out to Switzerland and go to a clinic, and the coldness of that and the aloneness of it. But worst of all, that we would have to travel whilst Mary was still well enough to travel, which would mean a premature death. So 2 years into her illness, we suddenly learned that the DC government was considering death with dignity. We cut her beach vacation short and we began lobbying the DC council members. Mary personally lobbied all 12 of them for the right to die on her own terms. She was intensely private. Who would imagine that a woman who would not talk about personal things would be the one who would be out front talking about her own death? And she became the reluctant face of DC's Death with Dignity campaign. After it passed in DC, Mary then had to lobby Congress to prevent them from overturning it. By February 2018, the doctors said that Mary had run out of options. The treatments had exhausted her body. She enrolled in hospice. All of her doctors knew of her wish for medical aid in dying, and 2 had indicated that they supported her. But when the time came, not one of them would write the prescription. After all she had fought for publicly over 2 solid years, and they turned their backs on her. So then we had to start fighting again to find a doctor who would help her. And after that, to find a pharmacist who would then fulfill the prescription. Eventually we did, and as her strength ebbed, she was still lobbying Sibley Hospital, Washington Hospital Center, George Washington Hospital Center. And to me, this was just plain wrong, that this was an articulate, extraordinarily sane woman in the late stages of an incurable disease who could not access medication and who even was enrolled in hospice. By late April, through friends of friends of friends, we eventually found somebody who was able to help. But in that final insult, after Mary had filled out all the paperwork and she had obtained the prescription, she then had to search hard for a pharmacist. I can't explain to you the relief when a month later, in May of 2018, Mary walked into my room and said, Stella, get off the phone, I've got something to tell you. She'd actually been able to pick up the medication, and all she felt was relief, stress. It all fell away. So we vacationed on the eastern shore of Virginia. We walked beaches. We watched wildlife. We ate good food, especially English teas, which is something Mary loved. We did the simple things that people enjoy in life. And 6 weeks before she died, she competed for the first time with her youngest puppy, which she'd adopted while she was sick, a rambunctious 18-year-old German Shepherd. Less than 2 months after that competition, the tumors had engulfed her body. Oxycontin and fentanyl were no longer controlling the pain. Her doctor offered Mary a very powerful injection, but she said, is that going to render me comatose? And the doctor said, yes, probably. Mary said, no, I want to be present. I want to be vital, right to the last. So she said no, and instead she told me to call family and friends. And family came from Maryland, Massachusetts, England, and France. She spent time with each person. And she shared memories, and they laughed. They were always laughing. And then one night she woke me up at 1 a.m. and she said, Stella, it's time. I didn't know it was coming, though I knew the end was near. We held each other's hands again, just as we did when the story began, and she swallowed the anti-nausea medication. And an hour later, the Seconal powder mixed with water. Our very last moments were ones of laughter. Mary fell back onto the pillows into a deep, deep sleep. And I climbed into bed beside her, and I held her through the hours until she died. So what lessons do I take from all of this for you as medical professionals? First and foremost, please, please respect your patients. Allow them to have some control at that last moments of their life when they have least control of all. These are profoundly difficult and very personal decisions. And do not think that you know better than your patient does. For someone confronting a terminal illness, yes, offer them treatment to extend their life. You know, at first Mary said, no, I don't want treatment. But the doctor said, no, we can give you years more. And they did, and she was glad. But when the pain became too much and they could not control that, that's when she wanted to die on her terms. So please respect your patients. For medical institutions, you really do need to adopt clear guidelines and make it clear to doctors whether or not that they can work with their patients. And you need also to draw up lists of participating doctors, those who will be willing and ready to help patients, so that if you personally do not feel that you in good conscience can write that prescription, you at the very least can refer the patient on to somebody who will. You owe that, ethically owe that to your patient. I respect you if you don't wish to do it yourself, but there are compassionate doctors who will. You shouldn't be putting people through the difficulties that Tom and that Mary and I faced. Hospice workers. Discuss the end-of-life options with your patients. You are fabulous. You are a gift unsung. I can't tell you how wonderful it was to work with you. The one thing that I missed was that opportunity to be able to be honest with you and say what Mary was planning, but we didn't dare with something that was so new. We didn't dare talk about the end-of-life options that Mary was going to pursue, and I regret that. So please have your policies in place so that you can discuss all the options that are available with the family and know what the wishes of the patients are. And for doctors, those doctors who write the prescription, please discuss with the families how they work. I admit that I avoided that inevitable moment of Mary taking the medication, even though we had it in the house. And when she was ready, had this ridiculous moment when at 1:30 in the morning, I was sitting on the bed surrounded by reams and reams of pharmaceutical instructions that come, all that small print that comes with a bunch of pills, trying to figure out the dosage because the doctor had given us 2 anti-nausea pills instead of the one I was expecting. And I wasn't sure whether to give her both, and I was so concerned that I might mess it all up and everything would go wrong. So please, as a doctor, take the time to sit down and explain how the medications work. How long ahead of time to take the anti-nausea pills, how many to take, how quickly does the medication itself take effect. I was rather shocked when within seconds, it seemed, after Mary had swallowed the second powder, she just fell back on the pillows and rendered her unconscious. And thirdly, don't forget to discuss just how long it takes to die. I fortunately was prepared for that, but it was 2 3/4 hours in the early morning before Mary's breathing gradually slowed. And she did have the death rattle, which fortunately I also had read about. But there was one moment when I was growing concerned. Was this medication going to work? And then what was I going to do? But slowly she took her last breath. Most importantly of all, I want you to understand and to take away that her dying was very peaceful. It was very peaceful. And it was exactly what she wanted. For me, this was the final act of love after 37.5 happy years together. Respecting the autonomy of the individual and their will for agency in that final moment of living is a gift. And it's a gift that you can give. Thank you very much.
Stella, thank you so much for sharing you and Mary's journey. Our next panelist is Wendy Engelman. Wendy's a retired teacher from Thornton, Colorado. In December 2018, Wendy's mother was diagnosed with glioblastoma and as a result sought to access Colorado's medical aid in dying law to avoid a prolonged death full of suffering. Wendy?
Hello. My family is small and close. That's Mom and I. My only sibling is a sister who flew in from Arizona to join my mom and dad, my husband and daughter and I for Christmas back in 2018. That's all of us. On December 22nd, all 6 of us went to Longmont to see a play together. While we were there, my 73-year-old doesn't take a single medication, is never ill mother suffered a grand mal seizure. Doctors in Longmont put her into a medically induced coma and had her transported by helicopter to University Hospital here in Aurora. While she was having CAT scans and MRIs, we all spent that night not knowing what she would be like if she came out of the coma. We were unbelievably lucky. She did come out of it the next day, talking, appearing to have full mental and physical function. Tests revealed a brain tumor. Doctors recommended surgery as soon as possible. Hospitals don't schedule surgery on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Again, we were lucky. That meant the room and the surgeon were both available to perform the surgery the very next day, Christmas Eve, which was also my daughter's birthday. Mom understood the risks and we understood them. She agreed to them. She wanted answers. We all expressed how much we loved each other. We knew there was a chance she wouldn't come out of the brain surgery. Again, we were lucky. Mom did come out of the surgery. This is the morning after. Her same cheerful self. That was where our luck ran out. The surgeon told us he removed as much of the tumor as he could and that he sent a sample to pathology for biopsy, but he was quite certain it was a glioblastoma. With a 12-month regimen of chemo and radiation treatment, he estimated Mom had 12 to 18 months to live. Without treatment, probably 3 to 6 months. Before we left the hospital on New Year's Day, we shared the biopsy results with Mom. She wasn't interested in chemo or radiation and immediately asked about the medical aid in dying option that she remembered our entire very politically diverse family had supported and voted for passing just a few years before here in Colorado. My sister and I talked to a hospital social worker. She said we would be referred to the palliative care department at university and they could help us pursue that option. As we brought my mom home and settled into our new reality, my sister and I began climbing the very steep road that is accessing medical aid in dying in Colorado. We scoured the internet. We found compassionate choices. We read the legislation. We found the formal written request. We scheduled a follow-up appointment with mom's surgeon and the palliative care department at university. We discovered that mom and dad's insurance would cover the emergency visit to university, but that hospital wasn't part of their regular plan, so it would not cover palliative care follow-up there. We confirmed this with the palliative care team at university. We asked them if there was any way we could see them just twice, even if it was private pay, to get the medical aid in dying prescription. They said no. Roadblock. They recommended we ask her surgeon at the follow-up appointment. Next, we called her primary care physician because it was the Christmas holiday. As Tom said, a terrible time to be in this situation as a family. Her doctor was out of town for 2 more weeks. We set an appointment for the following day with the office PA. We were painfully aware that time was our enemy in more ways than one. Because mom was dying of a brain tumor, it was likely she would lose cognitive functions as the tumor spread and grew. The language in the legislation was clear. She had to be of sound mind to qualify for the script. The PA said mom would need to have a psychological evaluation in order to qualify. She recommended getting her referred and in as soon as possible to start the process. She also told us that she, the PA, was neither willing nor qualified to write the script, but would make the referral for the psych eval so we could begin the process. She gave us a referral for hospice care. Calls to the psychologist revealed a month-long wait time just to get an appointment. Another roadblock. Meanwhile, we kept reading, kept researching. We used the Compassionate Choices website. We found there was one hospice in the entire Front Range that had a medical director willing to write the script for eligible clients, Seasons Hospice. We contacted them, told them we'd found them through Compassionate Choices website. We explained our situation. They said their previous medical director had left. They were no longer able to help patients who qualified under the Colorado law. Another roadblock. Our entire family went to the next follow-up visit with the surgeon. We all listened as he explained the glioblastoma diagnosis implications and the treatment plans. Mom explained to him she was not interested in those options, but instead would like his support for her decision to use medical aid in dying. She asked him to please document her request in his records as her first formal request and that she'd return in 2 weeks with the required written paperwork for the second request. He said he would document the request and get back to us. When we heard back from the surgeon, it was via the legal department at University Hospital. They denied our request for the script on the basis that mom was, first, not officially a patient of University Hospital because her insurance only covered the visit and surgery because it was all emergency care. And 2, they denied it because mom could live for 12 to 18 months if she had the very invasive treatments. They did not believe she met the requirements of the law as being terminal within 6 months. Big roadblocked. At this point, well into January, my sister and I were getting frantic. Research led us to CBD oil. We were actually standing in a marijuana dispensary about to make a purchase for my mom. We got a call from Sam with Compassionate Choices. He had our contact information from Seasons Hospice, asked how we were doing. We literally cried. He offered to meet. The 3 of us drank coffee and talked through all we had tried and all the dead ends we'd encountered. He recommended we don't worry about the psychological evaluation. It wasn't required. He suggested we go back to mom's primary physician, and he provided us with information to take to her called doctor-to-doctor pamphlets with phone numbers to call and questions and support. Mom's primary care doctor had never written the script, but when mom and all of us, like a little parade, all 6 of us, again, met with her, she said she believed in it and that she wanted to learn how so she could provide patients with mom the options they chose and they deserve. She documented the first request, scheduled the second appointment for 15 days later, talked to a colleague about the law and the individual case, and together they met with our entire family at the beginning of February and wrote the script. My sister and I took it to Scales Pharmacy. Again, pharmacies aren't easy to find. The same day, We had it filled and we picked it up 24 hours later. My mom had her medication in time for her 74th birthday on Valentine's Day, was immediately and profoundly thankful and relieved. Mom's health deteriorated through March, although we did get to fly down to Arizona with her for Rocky's spring training and share a week of sunshine. It's a picture of us down there. We took the meds with us just in case. We didn't end up using them when she was down there, and we have thought since then about the implications of that, but we did take them. Back here in Colorado, on April 12th, Mom determined her symptoms were preventing her from continuing to live an acceptable quality of life. The 6 of us gathered in her kitchen. We drank margaritas. We toasted our family and 54 years of her marriage. Mom drank her meds, and 6 minutes later, she was unconscious. 2 hours later, she was clinically dead. My daughter, who's a fire medic and has seen way too many people die, said it was the most peaceful death she'd ever witnessed. I share my story with you for this reason. It must be very tempting to move on from Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington, and those places where this legislation is passed and work toward passage in other places. I understand that, but this is important. Legislation does not equal access. Even though Coloradoans passed this law by 75%, looking at the statistics for who actually accessed medical aid in dying in Colorado in 2017 and 2018, too many people are not making it all the way down the difficult road that is this process. And now I understand why. Making this decision and then accessing this prescription should be a thoughtful, serious, focused effort. It should not be an endurance test to determine who is strong and committed enough to overcome gigantic hurdles. We need to build speed bumps in this road, not roadblocks. My elderly father could never have gotten this done alone. Anyone who is terminally ill, by definition, is already dealing with so much, mentally, physically, emotionally. I can't imagine how they could tackle this process. I don't know if I could have gotten it done without the help of my sister, who works in healthcare. And I have advanced degrees and all the time in the world to devote to the cause because I was retired. Please build speed bumps, not roadblocks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. What a powerful testimony. I want to, if I may, go back to slide 9 and 10. I apologize. I rushed through this slide, and I think I've seen some of the questions, and I think it will help to address some of the questions that we have. The eligibility requirements. You must be a resident of the state where the law is enacted. You have to be 18 years or older. You have to be terminally ill with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. A primary and a secondary doctor have to come to that prognosis. You have to be capable of making medical decisions. And you have to have the ability to self-ingest. Can we go to slide 10? And this slide shows you that polls suggest that 72% of Americans support medical aid in dying. And now over 1 in 5 actually have access. And once again, medical aid in dying is a process in which a terminally ill patient can request a prescription from a doctor to end their life in peace. So with that, we will open it up to questions. I have my handy helpers here, and we will address the first question. The first question actually would be to Dr. Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee, how does one prove that they have only 6 months to live?
So that is a very interesting question, and that is called prognostication. So in the clinical world, there are certain criteria that a certain disease has that can lead to prognostication of the life expectancy of a person if that disease would take its natural course. Usually in medical aid in dying, you have the primary physician, who is the attending physician who has taken care of this patient for their disease, walk the journey with them, understand them. They actually are very equipped medically through their education and their clinical skills to know the prognoses of this disease. The secondary physician in medical aid in dying, who is the consulting physician, also has the same education, the same knowledge, and has access to all the medical records and meets the patient and can come to the same prognoses. Many a times there may be disagreements between the prognoses, in which case medical aid in dying would be refused to the patient. However, we've seen prognostication is something that physicians are well taught to do in many fields, especially in oncology, in hematology, and hospice and palliative medicine. And that's why we often have two physicians looking at prognostication for a patient. Ultimately, what I always tell my patients is that even the prognoses of 6 months or less is determined clinically based on the disease progression. The time and the place and the destiny when we die is something that I personally say is up to the superpowers or whenever our time is written. Some people can live beyond their 6 months. Some people can live much less than that when the prognosis is 6 months. However, it is a decision that is made by the patient and the physicians in order to determine prognoses and eligibility with medical aid in dying. Thank you.
Thank you. I see it. There's a question regarding whether or not there is a list of doctors that is provided for terminally ill patients and their families who want to use this option. There is not a list of doctors. However, there is a Find Care tool on the Compassionate Choices website where you can look up where there are hospitals in these states that have supportive policies. Thank you for that question. Another question we have is directed to Tom. This participant's, there's a quick question I can answer, I'm sorry. How can we get a recording of this video session? It will be posted on the City of Hope and CNC's website in a couple of weeks. Now, to Tom, please discuss how you told your daughters about your wife and how they're doing now.
So that was a very, I think it was a slow process, right? We knew for months this was going to happen because we had talked about it as a couple together. And we slowly started introducing the idea over a matter of 4 to 5 months that was how Christine would want to go. We talked about Christine's mom and how her experience was and how Christine wanted something different. We talked about death rituals. We discussed the grief process and what that meant. They saw her in a lot of pain, right? Over the years. They got to see her struggles. They got to see the good times. They got to see the bad times. They got to see the days where she didn't get up off the sofa at all. They got to see the hospital stays. They got to see all that and know where she was at. And so that made that discussion much easier to say, hey, we're getting closer to the end. This is how Christine wants to go. I highly recommend taking use of hospice's grieving policies. They help with a lot of this stuff, especially with children. They were 14 and 10 at the time she passed. So those are things we did with them is grief counseling, talking, visiting, just lots of conversations. We did a butterfly release right after she took the medication. We went outside. She passed away in about 25 minutes after she took it. And we had the kids come outside and we did a butterfly release at that time to symbolize her going. And we did rituals and processes to help with that.
Thank you, Tom. I think we'll entertain one more question to all of the panelists. The question is, did family and friends have a hard time understanding this choice, or were they generally supportive? Let's start with Wendy.
We received nothing but support. Truly, family and friends were very supportive. The only challenges that we encountered weren't getting the help that we needed from the medical community and hospitals and hospices and palliative care groups. We were very fortunate with family and friends.
Stella, would you go next, please?
Yes, my younger brother is a Catholic priest. We didn't grow up as a Catholic family, but he converted and is a Catholic priest. Roger flew over from England and came to be with us at the time. Though it's not something that his faith supports, he recognized the pain Mary was in, that she was very close to death, and the importance to her of having that dignity in the final moments of her life, and he respected it. And love my brother for doing that. My other family members are very supportive.
I have a similar experience. Most of our roadblocks were from the legal system, legal system and healthcare systems trying to block it. But my dad didn't understand at first. He came around and became very supportive of her going the way she wanted to go. He himself passed away from cancer this year. He chose not to use medical aid in dying. He went without eating and drinking. He went that route. But he recognized that she needed the power over her own destiny and her own path, and he respected that. So I had to say family and friends were supportive.
Thank you. One more question I'm going to sneak in. Matthew and Stella, have you had any contact with palliative care teams during your journey? And I think it's Tom. They said Matthew, but I believe it's to you, Tom.
So palliative care versus hospice care, it's an interesting journey. If you have less than 6 months, California, I think, doesn't distinguish as much between what you can and can't. And you can still have treatments on hospice in some situations. I don't quite understand all the details myself, but it just means you know these treatments aren't going to prolong life beyond that 6-month window, apparently. So there was care given to ease with pain and suffering during those final months, not as aggressive treatment to cure care, if that's what the question's about, I think.
We had met with the palliative care nurse quite early on in the process to kind of better understand what they could do. And when we enrolled in hospice, in fact, the doctor who eventually wrote the prescription was very active and was a doctor working with a hospice, and so very experienced in geriatric care and end-of-life care. And it was the first time that she had been, she'd written a prescription for medical aid in dying, since the legislation was very new in Washington, D.C. So the hospice did provide really excellent palliative care and plenty of medication to help control the pain. It got to the point where the fentanyl, OxyContin, it was not controlling the pain anymore, and was at that point that that Mary's doctor offered to give her a very powerful injection which would have controlled the pain, but it would have basically made her unconscious, and that was the turning point for Mary. It wasn't enough. And prior to that, she was taking pills and what really wasn't happening. She was falling out of bed. She was passing. Things were getting really quite bad. So yes, we did have palliative care. The options were explained. And she said, I want to be here. I want to be able to be with you and say goodbye. I don't want to be knocked out and just go out that way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There was a question about pharmacies and how can you find pharmacies that are supportive. That information can also be found on the Compassion and Choices website, and we will put that in at the end of this presentation, the website there. Also, if there are some questions, there are a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. But there will be an email where you can send some of these questions to as well, and we will try our best to.
If I just add one thing on pharmacy, I don't know if this is a useful tip or not, but the one that we eventually found was one that had done a lot of work with HIV/AIDS patients in the 1980s when medications were still very new and very experimental. So we found an independent pharmacy.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that being said, is there anything else, Tom or Wendy, you'd like to say as we wrap up our Q&A session? All right. Well, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I just think it's important, like from my perspective, I would have loved it if the doctor, if doctors had been more upfront about where their stance was. I mean, we're an oncologist. He knows that we're discussing a disease that when we first started, it has a typical lifespan of 18 months, right? And we're in year 4. And this, I guess, the conversation hadn't come up from him towards us. It always has to come from the patient, it seems, to the doctor. I would love to see doctors be more proactive and saying, hey, this is your typical lifespan. I typically deal with people. I know doctors don't like to say this, but think about what your life is like. Think about where you're headed. What do you want your life to be like so I can provide you better care the way you want care? And that can happen early in the process, knowing that, yeah, sometimes it might be hard to broach that topic, but I think it's a topic people need their doctors to broach sometimes, if not the majority of the time. And you're dealing with cases that it's going to be anywhere from 6 months, 6 years. It's somewhere in there, but it's part of the journey, part of the process. And people don't know, they're overwhelmed. We're dealing with this care, trying to juggle finances, juggle healthcare, juggle kids, juggle relationships that are falling, like people around us, and trying to keep these relationships alive, yet deal with this cancer or deal with some terminal disease. And it helps if you're in our corner talking to us, telling us things, reminding us of things we might need to think about, things we might need to talk about. I think that's an important thing for me to think about, and from a healthcare perspective. I also think that hospices too, talk to them. Some hospices were willing to have a death doula present, and some were not willing to have a death doula present when Christine ingested her medical aid in dying. So we had to work around that and talk to different ones and seeing, what are you comfortable with your nurses being around? And our nurse had to leave during this process and come back later and fill out the death certificate. And one thing that's absolutely amazing to me is that the death certificate said cancer on it. That I broke down crying when I received her death certificate, to realize that, yes, it pinpointed the underlying problem of and why Christine died, not how she died, but why she died. And that meant a lot to me, gave me a lot of comfort.
Wendy, I didn't know if you wanted to end on anything else.
Something that is worth considering. We took my mom's medication with us to Arizona because she was still traveling. She was mobile. I don't think this is a state by state issue. We're a very mobile society. Eventually, we need to address this as a nation. Nothing happened when she was down there. She was good, but we knew we could have been a test case at that time, and no one should have to go through that. We need to come together as a country and as a healthcare system and make better choices. This should not just be state by state. If you happen to live in the right place, you won the lottery when you're terminally ill. That's wrong.
Thank you for that, Wendy. That's why we are working very hard to expand this legislation across the nation. All right, with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our participants, in the City of Hope. And with that, I'll turn it over.
For additional information or educational opportunities or to reference the recording from today, please visit us at cityofhope.org/CME. To learn more about medical aid in dying and connect with providers who have helped their patients utilize these laws, please visit compassionandchoices.org, D2D for the Doc to Doc program. Please join us next month on December 3rd when we will discuss literature and the end of life, poetry, books, and patient stories. And once again, we'd like to thank our faculty for sharing your stories, and thank you to Compassionate and Choices for partnering with us. And most of all, thank you to you for joining us today. We hope to see you next time.